to introduce I'd like to introduce myself quickly. I'm Craig Gibson. I'm the co-convener for the HX Libraries Group, and with me here is Sarah Hartman-Caverly, who's the other co-convener. Yes, I see a number of you showing up now, and we're very glad that you're able to join us today for one of the HX Libraries Symposia. And the topic today is library neutrality as public service in liberal democratic governance. And two of our HX Libraries members, Michael Dudley and John Wright, will be presenting to us on this topic. Michael is the librarian for political science, history, and urban studies at the University of Winnipeg, and he has degrees in city planning and library and information studies, and he's worked in the past as a research associate for University of Winnipeg's Institute of Urban Studies, and he's been an editorial chair for Plan Canada magazine, has been much involved in planning in general. John Wright is currently the director of the business library at University of Calgary, and also the political science and public policy librarian there. He's been in various roles at the University of Calgary, including director of arts and culture. He was the interim director of the University of Calgary Press, and he's also worked as a policy analyst for the Canadian Parliament and Elections Canada. So that's by way of brief introduction to two members of our group who've given a lot of thought to this very fraught topic of neutrality, both in libraries and perhaps more expansively in other spheres as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael and John, and we'll be taking questions. I'm sure they'll be welcoming questions at the end of their presentation.
Oh, okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Craig, for that introduction. I'm Michael Dudley from the University of Winnipeg. John and I have been working on this as a paper for well over a year and a half. And we've been sharing our ideas with the Heterodox Libraries community. So we really want to thank our colleagues at Heterodox Libraries. And thank you to Daniel and the Heterodox Academy for hosting us today.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Okay, shall we get rolling? We were going to introduce ourselves, but I can't top Craig's introduction, so I think we'll just move right into the meat of the matter.
Yeah, we get.
I don't know. Okay, so here is a short version of our talk. We're now ready for questions. No, seriously, this is from a recent article we read by a journalist named Jamie Paul, and it just seemed to speak or sum up where we're going with our talk here. What we're going to talk about today, first of all, with regards to our outline, just waiting for that slide to pop up. There we go. The subject is what brought us to this is a crisis in public libraries and librarianship over issues of neutrality and intellectual freedom, which we believe is part of the larger political polarization, which I'm sure that most of you are familiar with and may have experienced in your own lives. Specifically, we're arguing that neutrality and liberalism have been misunderstood and misrepresented and essentially mischaracterized in the efforts to achieve social justice or other goals. And what there is crying out for is a need for strong liberal institutions and to strengthen those institutions to mediate conflict. Our approach is to analyze libraries not as information providers, but as agents of governance using political science theory. So to use that analytical framework and then to flip it around and use planning theory, how professionals, how another profession as agents of the state interact in the public sphere in a very contentious field to provide a normative and prescriptive approach by the end of our talk. We'll focus very specifically on two types of value neutrality that are provided in planning practice. And from that, we will develop a four-dimensional model of neutrality. And at the end, we will use this to synthesize a new definition of library neutrality that we hope will enable practitioners and the community to understand what really needs to be done in order to provide public service. So because this is highly interdisciplinary and we don't know where the audience is coming from, which particular aspects of any of this the audience are coming from, the flow of the argument is essentially to present liberal thought, liberal institutions, libraries as liberal institutions, and to switch gears then to planning in the post-war era under liberal democracies, and to use that to formulate this four-dimensional library neutrality, and then show how this can give liberal outcomes. So as a start, and I should say here, when we say liberalism and liberal institutions, we're not using that in the partisan sense. We're not naming, for example, the Liberal Party of Canada. We're not talking about liberals versus conservatives, as you see in the North American debate. Rather, we're talking about philosophical liberalism and liberal democratic institutions that we now have that are based on that. So liberalism itself is a very broad field, so broad that various practitioners may not recognize each other as liberal. But when we're talking about liberalism, we're basically boiling it down to the understood principles as enacted in contemporary liberal democracies. There's a focus on individual liberty, privileging individual liberty, although that is embedded in or bounded by the communities that the individuals reside. There's a universality of inclusion and a universality of application that focuses on equality and egalitarianism, but again, bounded within cultural national contexts. It's usually enacted through some form of pluralist enterprise. And liberalism also has a theoretical and a practical reasoning within it. The shared means of evaluating truthfulness, a means of determining desirability of action, and of course, political science and planning are very much about those latter aspects. So in general, when we talk about liberalism versus illiberalism, first of all, in the values and practices, liberalism tends to privilege incremental reform, whereas illiberalism focuses more on revolutionary radical change, on dismantling and recreating or creating new structures. In how it goes about this, usually liberal democracies, liberalism is about dialogue, compromise, and consensus, whereas liberal values much more invoke censorship and these no debate, canceling, we've heard about recently, a much more proscriptive approach. Liberalism is inherently skeptical in testing itself, whereas certainty of what they're doing is certainly very much a part of illiberalism. Liberalism resists concentrations of power, be they in the state or within corporations, whereas illiberalism relies on or appeals to power as a way of solving problems or achieving goals. As I mentioned before, liberalism tends to be pluralist, whereas illiberalism tends to be tribalism. So one is more about heterogeneity, one is much more about homogeneity. Excuse me, I always have problems with that word. Liberalism generally acknowledges fallibilism and the right to be wrong in some ways, whereas illiberalism usually has a teleology being on the right side of history. There's usually within dialogue, compromise, and consensus a moral complexity and a multi-sided approach. Illiberalism tends to be much more about othering, a Manichaean worldview where there's one set versus the other, dichotomies, black and white, that sort of an approach. And liberalism is practiced. We love this quote, which talks about the case for the necessity and possibility of imperfectly egalitarian social reform and ever greater, if not absolute, tolerance of human difference. This is a very Rawlsian, you know, or have your favorite political philosophers. This is a very Rawlsian take. It's very much on the process of liberalism and the value of that in itself. And as a very specific means of conflict resolution, we define liberalism as a conflict resolution mechanism, not a political ideology. It's not a solution to disagreements, but a system that allows us to disagree, which I think is also a very nice way of putting it. It's a nice quote. Turning to liberal institutions, again, meaning, of course, the liberal democracies, the general group of liberal democracies that we have today, they have these commonalities. They're founded in law, monitored and adjusted by democratic accountability. And they generally governance acts through a complex, dense web of interactive institutions. They tend to protect a bounded, qualified individual liberty, rights and autonomy, and contain that with a vision of common welfare. They provide instruments and processes of dialogue, debate, and conflict resolution. They ensure provision of equal opportunity, not necessarily equal outcomes. And they ensure that policy-driven social change is undertaken with the consent of the governed, going back to that first point.
Okay. And so now we're going to look at the particular debate about neutrality in libraries and the tendency in the literature to adopt more interventionist approaches. First of all, the institutional context that the American Library Association has the Library Bill of Rights, which was first published in 1939, and it has been amended since. It basically says that libraries should provide materials and information presenting all points of view, and materials cannot be proscribed or removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval. As well, libraries should make meeting rooms available on an equitable basis, regardless of the beliefs or affiliations of individuals or groups requesting their use. And what we've been seeing in recent years are challenges both to print materials from across the political spectrum and also protests against particular speakers. But there is this, the Bill of Rights that has these declarations. The American Library Association also has its code of ethics, one of the principles of which says that we distinguish between our personal convictions and professional duties and do not allow our personal beliefs to interfere with a fair representation of the aims of our institutions or the provision of access to information. Now, even though this is the American Library Association, it should be noted, of course, John and I are both Canadians. Canada does not have anymore an equivalent Canadian Library Association. All of our library schools are accredited by the ALA. And so what happens with the ALA is also very influential in Canada. Some observations about these statements is the most important is that neither the Bill of Rights or the Code of Ethics or other supporting documentation actually uses the word neutrality or defines what it means. And that is one of the major reasons why there is such a debate that has lasted for decades, is that there hasn't really been a definition of what is meant by neutrality. These documents also seem to assume an undifferentiated public, talking about service to the public, but not that there are multiple constituencies in the public that all may have competing interests and values. We read about the rights of the individual in an abstract fashion, but without referring to the agency of those responsible for affirming them, i.e. library workers. Instead, the library workers' relationship to the institution is more foregrounded rather than their ethical obligations towards members of the public. So over many decades, then, there has been a debate over neutrality and intellectual freedom, but in recent years, the tenor The professional response to this has gotten more intense and extreme. We're seeing library workers submitting open letters to their libraries, protesting speakers, protesting books. The collection controversies as well have gotten much more numerous. Illiberal challenges from across the political spectrum. There tends to be on the political right more of a challenge against materials for young people, usually based on matters of sexuality, whereas challenges from the left tend to be more about particular authors who have said or done things that have been found to be problematic and that the library shouldn't purchase their books. But we think that these demonstrate simplistic understandings across the political spectrum, left and right, about what neutrality means. Is it in fact a statement of fact, or is it an aspiration? But what's emerged is a more interventionist ethos in librarianship to try to address and resolve matters of social justice. We believe and are going to propose in this presentation that there is a liberal response and a process to all of these manifestations. The American Library Association recently began a campaign against book bans that is encouraging libraries to say that parents should not be making decisions for other parents' children about what to read, that individuals should be trusted to make their own decisions about what to read. And yet at the same time, the ALA in January of 2021, the ALA Council adopted this resolution to condemn white supremacy and fascism as antithetical to library work. The preamble says, whereas libraries have upheld and encouraged white supremacy, both actively through discriminatory practices and passively through, and these are the words, a misplaced emphasis on neutrality. And we see 5 citations there. If you follow through on these citations, none of them actually offer any evidence that neutrality rhetoric has emboldened and encouraged white supremacy and fascism. The document seems to assume a static and ahistorical permanence to racism, that it's never going to go away. And it doesn't acknowledge all of the progress that has been made since the 1950s as a result of the civil rights movement. But internally, problematically, this document contradicts the principles of the Bill of Rights, and as well as that Unite Against Book Bans campaign, because, on the one hand, ALA is saying that people should be trusted, and here it's saying that people can't be trusted to read certain books. In the critical librarianship, or crit lib, or radical librarianship literature, this case against library neutrality is really principally coming from the political left. Literature that promotes critical social justice, foregrounding the needs of marginalized populations. And the arguments in these many articles and books is that library neutrality only consists of value neutrality, and that libraries can't be value neutral institutions, that neutrality is a myth, a mask to support the status quo and existing power structures, that by assuming neutrality, librarians are being irresponsible morally, that it maintains a culture of white supremacy and hatred and bigotry. But we would note that this literature also involves what we would describe as casual defamations of authors and of speakers, and also of library users, the audiences who come to hear these speakers, who are wrapped up in these accusations that conservative right-leaning speakers are Nazis, that gender-critical speakers are TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, that these are bigots, that they're hate groups, that the audiences are hate-filled, which we feel really is problematic and only exacerbates polarization. The literature also demonstrates that library scholars are abandoning neutrality and advocating really explicit intervention in society. R. David Lankus, in his book, The Atlas of New Librarianship, says that the mission of the library is to improve society. And at one point says that this mission of improving society trumps the value norms of any one given community. Far more problematically and illiberal is Sam Popowich in his book, Confronting the Democratic Discourse of Librarianship, who writes that librarians need to, quote, intervene explicitly in the intellectual and cultural lives of our fellow citizens through a collective commitment to concrete social justice. He writes that this may necessitate an insistence on the party form, that's Communist Party, dictatorship and people's war, or some other coercive means to force, that's his word, those in opposition to these goals to stop and fall in line, which will require a serious rethinking of democracy and political theory. This is really extreme illiberalism, this rhetoric. Some of the greatest minds in history have thought about democracy for the last 2,500 years. I don't really think a cadre of Marxist librarians should be rethinking democracy for all of society. In 2021, we saw the resolution against white supremacy, but in June, the ALA also added an additional code of ethics, number 9, that says that we affirm the inherent dignity and rights of every person. We work to recognize and dismantle systemic and individual biases, to confront inequity and oppression, to enhance diversity and inclusion, and to advance racial and social justice in our libraries, communities, profession, and associations through awareness, advocacy, education, collaboration services, and allocation of resources and spaces. Now, obviously, the latter part of this are things that libraries have always done, but there are some troubling things in the wording of this statement. What does it mean for libraries to affirm the rights of every person? That's usually left up to a constitution and the Supreme Court, and in Canada, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the amendments to the American Constitution. Dismantling systemic and individual biases. Are library workers supposed to, again, intervene in the minds of individuals? And confronting inequity and oppression. Is this supposed to happen everywhere in the world? There are no bounds or limits. So we're going to come back to this towards the end of our presentation. We're going to rewrite this statement according to our 4-dimensional model of library neutrality. Now, the real world context, the immediate context, is that the ALA charged a committee to come up with alternative language to neutrality. And this coming Monday, the ALA is starting their consultations. Monday, it's going to be for public library workers. The following month for school libraries, and the month after that for academic libraries. So I would encourage anyone who is a member of ALA, who works at these various libraries sectors, to sign up and participate. If John and I are able to convince you that library neutrality is worth preserving, and that an alternative like radical empathy, which is on the table, won't quite cut it, then we'd really encourage you to participate in these consultations. So yes, there has been an intensification of this debate, this perceived tension over social justice versus intellectual freedom and library neutrality, but it is a long-standing debate, going back at least to the beginning of the 1970s. In the late 1960s, the ALA's Social Responsibilities Roundtable began advocating that libraries should stake out public positions on controversial issues, like the Vietnam War, like nuclear proliferation, etc. But David Berningshausen at the University of Minnesota said that such non-library issues are outside the professional scope and competencies of librarianship, and that adopting the social responsibility concept and explicitly positioning the library as an instrument of social change would destroy the integrity of the ALA. Well, this sparked the Berningshausen debate, as it was known at the time. But over the decades, there has been this critical consensus that libraries can't be neutral. And so and again, because the term was never defined, the debate has continued to this day. So we want to defend library neutrality. We believe it's been misunderstood and misrepresented. And on the basis of this misapprehension and misunderstanding, there's now this perceived urgency to replace the language because of crises related to racism, inequality, gender, colonialism, etc. Fans of the animated series Futurama will recognize the image on the right, the alien species, the neutrals, who are incapable of any strong emotions or coming to any strong decision about anything, hence the slogan, live free or don't. That's not how we see neutrality, as you will see. Now, the context for library neutrality that we think is really essential is that libraries in Western countries certainly are in very diverse, multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith societies. And that diversity, the multiculturalism just is getting greater all the time. And so we want to keep that in mind. We want to come back to it, but we're stating that even though this debate is taking place within the context of discourse around diversity, equity, and inclusion, we think diversity is a really important factor for retaining library neutrality. So now I'll turn it over to John to take us through political science theory and into urban planning.
Thanks, Michael. Just waiting for my next prompt, as usual. Why political science and urban planning, do you say, apart from the obvious that these are the field expertise that Michael and I hold? In our discussions, we have noticed in discussing about these things over a long period of time, as Mike said, that both of these are concerned with theoretical and practical reason. With regard to urban planning, all planning is political is perhaps the most political, if anybody's attended a planning meeting, the most political aspect of municipal politics. Planning is a function of government. Planners cannot implement plans outside of the function of government. And together, both political science in its practical side as public policy and urban planning, together they both guide and manage social change. And they do it in real time, in real situations. And when we talk about problems and problematization, what we need to clarify here is social policy is really about wicked problems. And a quick review of those, library and planning and all public policy share these wicked problems. Wicked problems resist simple formulations. Homelessness has no single cause. Today, the issue of today, inflation, people are trying to wrap their heads around what is causing inflation. They're usually symptoms of other problems. Again, homelessness, you can think of that there's many underlying more foundational issues of which homelessness is a symptom. We can say the same again of inflation. There's no stopping rule. These issues can never say they're resolved. They can be temporarily obeyed, but again, because they come from more foundational structures, and it usually comes back in another way. But at the same time, there is resolution in the match that every intervention counts. And this, of course, is also part of the incrementalism and iterative approach that we're taking. Every intervention counts. It changes the instantiation of the underlying conditions. Every problem is unique. This is linked to the previous point. So best practices can't be transplanted. Everything occurs at a particular conjunction of resources and circumstance. And certainly in planning and in other things, the planner has no right to be wrong, by which we mean it's not that they can't be misunderstood or incorrect, but the consequences of a policy once put in place usually has unintended consequences and long-term impacts. So that in addressing a particular situation, you normally create a cascade of other situations that need to be addressed. So turning specifically to political science, why political science? In short, the short answer is librarians are not trained or educated appropriately about government institutions. Whereas political science, librarianship has a little or any endogenous theorization with regard to most things, actually, because it is a practical training set. People come with a varied set of educational ontological backgrounds, and then they're given library skills layered on top of those. So appropriate importations are required from other disciplines, or in absence, are dragged in inappropriately. Library theory and practice, as I said, focuses on practical information, people management, best practices, not theorizing institutions or governance or some of these larger issues. I love this quote from Christine Pauley: "The prevailing style of LIS discourse uses techno-administrative language to address technical and managerial problems. Most professional literature describes applied research into information literacy, provides economic and educational justification for its existence, and passes on practical tips." That is my, certainly, library education. On the other hand, political science theory, again, a broad field, does very much concentrate on issues of institutionalization, democracy or non-democracy, social justice. Political science is well theorized on this. And libraries are public institutions, but librarians don't often, if ever, theorize what they do within this lens of how institutions behave in liberal democracies, in the North American case. What is the nature and the role of the state? What differences and understandings between professionals and non-professionals in this role of the state as an institution and the role of actors in liberal democracies? So I love this quote from a former professor of mine who used to say, when teaching about state theory, if you think the state is an abstract concept, try knocking the hat off a policeman. And you'll find the state is pretty concrete in what it can do and what it will do. So what is the state, government? It is a social construct like everything else, and different theories see it differently. There's Marxist theories of the state, classic liberalism has theories of the state, there's feminist versions of the state, there's constructivism, there's neo-institutionalism, this goes on and on and on. But a couple of political scientists a while back, Dunleavy and O'Leary, did us a real service in realizing that in broad terms is a common set of conceptualizations on how the state is operationalized as a social structural agent, how it works or how it's supposed to work. And these things cross all of these different versions. And they posit that in ideal terms, not in real terms, there's a cipher state, a guardian state, and a partisan state. And in the interest of neutrality, I will say, give away the game here and say that the guardianship model is what we are developing and what we believe inherently is the most liberal approach. So what you say is a cipher state. Well, in the cipher state, the state is not really there or explained. The state is an empty structure. It's an arena within which competing agents compete according to their roles. There is no independent interest of the state itself. Outcomes are majority decided according to the rules, certainly in democratic form. And neutrality is expressed, if it's expressed as an absence or an inaction or a mechanical adjudication. The guardian state, by contrast, institutions have their own agency, a strong sense of their institutional force as for balancing competing interests. The agency itself is guided by norms of Weberian professionalism, which is to say a professional cadre of bureaucrats and experts with specific expertise. It positions itself as neutral. We'll get back to neutral again, of course. That is ensuring the integrity and the proper functioning of the political system and its institutional mandate. That's its version of neutrality. And outcomes are adjudicated by various stakeholders within a rules-based state. Now, the partisan state, institutions have directive leadership and or authority. Individuals or small groups hold the dominant interest and use the state in that dominant interest. Direction is top-down. So outcomes are set, they're goal-oriented, they're targets, and they're delivered by institutions acting as a transmission belt of ideas, a one-way transmission belt of ideas and actions. Neutrality, if considered at all is considered by assent and is secondary to the need for a dominant state to resolve intractable or wicked problems. But what Dunleavy and O'Leary don't really get into, which I think is critical to us, is perceptions of the state. How do different actors within society see the state? In general, the public tends to see the state and electoral politics through a cipher framework, if they think about it at all, which is fair. It's not slamming anybody. Most people are far too busy to spend a lot of time thinking about politics. That is insider beltway stuff that people who have time and money or are paid to devote their attention to. So the general assumption is agencies of the state are democratically directed. Policy outcomes should shift according to electoral outcomes based essentially on a majority will. The library itself is therefore a cipher. You can say it's a pun because not many people actually know what happens in libraries either. Usually an uncontested public space where useful information and service are provided on demand for taxes rendered. And the libraries are therefore an expression of public will and public values. The margins of debate around what libraries do are usually, this is a public viewpoint, around costs and affordability and appropriate, often utilitarian information content. User needs, how much does it cost? Can we do it? Whereas library workers have a very different perception of the state. Libraries and librarians have traditionally and officially adopted a guardian role. See again for the guardian role, ALA Bill of Rights. Libraries, they say, are the most competent authority to speak on the public right to access information, which they link specifically to participatory democracy and is often expressed as citizenship. And I don't mean legal citizenship, I mean an autonomous individual able to participate in society. And this is sort of the seed of that libraries should improve society, improve people thing. That's a kernel from which everything else seems to develop. In guaranteeing freedom to information, which is often conflated with freedom of expression, they see themselves therefore as constitutional agents, agents acting out a part of the Constitution, and public policy protectors. Traditionally, libraries have espoused strong and repeated messaging about strict neutrality, that's that non-personal or impersonal objective handling of information, provision of information services backed by an undefined professional judgment. And the margins of debate are on providing informational and social need. Again, that autonomy of citizenship and the needs to access information. We stay here also that libraries belong to specific liberal states. This is important to understand as well. They operate in specific ways according to the normative and constitutional arrangements of each state. They are specifically embedded. So in Canada, in our constitution, our primary raison d'etre is peace, order, and good government. So in Canada, many Canadians are surprised to find out that they have no First Amendment rights, they have no Miranda rights, because those are US constitutional instruments. In the United States, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is the purpose of the Constitution. It's a very universal individualism that privileges individualism far more than the Canadian version. And different laws, different ethos, different boundaries do make a difference with regard to what the controversies are and how some things are defined. So hate speech, for example, is defined very differently in Canada and the United States, and how it is handled is very different in Canada and the United States. Those of you who work in collections, you'll find out that copyright and fair use is another good example of this. Fair use versus fair dealing. So this should infer, or should imply, should be inferred that there are competencies around basic ideas of freedom that are for other agencies of the state to adjudicate. It's not that libraries and librarians can't raise them or shouldn't advocate for them, particularly as it affects their competencies, but they're part of that large web, that coalition of institutions. Libraries are not single solutions, and they cannot invent or define certain things. Those certain things are these normative and constitutional arrangements, which are predetermining. This should also inform profession that there are state-instituted parameters, jurisdictional and normative boundaries within which they operate. These differences in tensions, these differences in perceptions create tensions. I mean, there's an obvious tension between the public and professional interpretations of neutrality and role, particularly on who gets the state community standards and why. There's now also, as we have outlined, a growing tension within the profession on what the nature of professional responsibility means. Both of these tensions reflect an absence of understanding of the roles of professional balance and of perpetuating the library itself as an institution, an instantiation of a generalized public interest or public good. And there is also a general lack of acknowledgement of the agency, autonomy, and the responsibility of others. Within the profession, the tendency has become to oppose a partisan agency based on the conflation of guardianship with vanguard leadership, as I've described it. I can go into that in questions if you want, to address wicked problems. And without the profession, coming from without, the tendency has also become partisan, eschewing public policy experience for arena politics and winner-take-all democracy. So in this environment, we believe that libraries need a proven model of engagement to counter the drift into partisan problem fixing. They need a mechanism to operationalize how a state agency, forget, I used operationalize twice, that's terrible, a mechanism for how a state agency operationalizes a participatory model, one that respects and resolves cipher and guardian tensions, fulfills democratic functions and constitutional legal accountabilities, respects professional competencies while putting liberal democratic boundaries on them, and binds all participants, all stakeholders to a common commitment to participation in a common enterprise, i.e. something that replicates and perpetuates the local, national, cultural mode of liberal democracy.
And we are hoping to show how planning can provide that model. So I'm going to look at different modes of post-war urban planning and what they reveal about practitioner neutrality. This image seems to suggest a sort of philosopher king ruling over the polis. And you know, Frank Lloyd Wright in the 1930s proposed a model for a utopia in which the planner was kind of a philosopher king. So as you're going to see, there's this evolution from the planner as this expert above all to greater and greater levels of public participation. So what do we mean by modern urban planning? Obviously, cities are as old as civilization, going back thousands of years. But in terms of the modern profession of urban planning, these are professionals that are trained to define problems, to model and analyze interventions, to design and carry out one of these solutions, and then evaluate the impacts of these interventions. And as the different modes that I'm going to show you illustrate, there's been varying levels of public involvement in those processes. But as John explained with wicked problems, planners have spent many decades theorizing about their rights, their ability, their responsibility, the ethics involved in intervention. They have theorized intervention far, far more thoroughly than librarians have in their literature. Planners are granted warrant by society to be that practical application of policy, to do changes in the built environment, to actually carry out social and physical change. Librarians have been granted no such warrant. So what does it look like in the planning profession to have that interventionist responsibility? And what does it say about neutrality? So we're looking at 4 models in the post-war period: rational comprehensive planning from 1945 on, it's still quite influential; advocacy planning emerging in the mid-1960s; radical planning in the early 1970s; and communicative or collaborative planning in the early 1990s. So rational comprehensive planning is a scientific, rational, modernist planning. It's entirely empirical and positivist. The only information that matters is data. The expert planner is the one who is carrying this all out in a completely objective and neutral scientific way. This mode of planning is value neutral because values are seen to be irrelevant. They simply don't play a role and the planner's own values are not going to influence the outcome. But the expert planner acts on behalf of the public, an undifferentiated public, for a unitary public good. Rational comprehensive planning is also known as planning for. And in the post-war period, we see a lot of critiques of rational comprehensive planning for its focus on efficiency, rationalization, and infrastructure. Massive scale projects like the interstate highway system, massive public housing projects like the notorious Pruitt-Igoe project in St. Louis, warehousing welfare recipients and people of color in segregated neighborhoods, sprawling subdivisions with restrictive racial covenants where white homeowners couldn't sell to Black buyers. So even though rational comprehensive planners assumed their work was neutral, it actually was not, in fact, value neutral at all. There were very definite ideas about who would live where and under what circumstances. So these critiques were that planners simply weren't capable of systemized reason. You can't have a grasp of all the information that would be necessary, and not all the information that's relevant is simply data, statistics, ground measurements. That we need qualitative information. We need to listen to the people who live in these neighborhoods. And the critiques, the planning literature argued for more incremental approaches over these all at once mega projects, and certainly rejected that the planner's work was neutral and value free. At the same time, there were also tensions in this literature, because as soon as you start getting into allowing in all these different versions and different ways of knowing and stories and counter stories in a postmodern environment, there's a risk of falling into a postmodern abyss of relativism. So how do we have bounded rationality? How do we get more diverse sources of information? How do we get more incremental planning? So in the mid-1960s, we see advocacy planning, in which the planner would act on behalf of stakeholders, clearly rejecting value neutrality and aligning the planner's values with those of the stakeholder community, and representing the stakeholders and their plans before planning commissions, where they would be adjudicated. So planning would be much more like a legal system in this conception. And this was known as planning with, as opposed to rational comprehensive's planning for. Radical planners in the early 1970s took issue with advocacy's even-handedness, that planning commissions may reject these plans, that the planner needs to be the agent of the community needs to be doing the planning. The planner needs to avoid imposing their values. They can't be value neutral, but more than likely, the planner will again align their values with those of the community. But this kind of radical planning was needed by stakeholders to address urgent social and environmental problems. This is known as planning by. There are critiques in the literature in the 80s and beyond about radical planning, and saying that planners do need to have some critical distance from the community's projects of emancipation. Because if a planner is too partisan and they completely get subsumed by the community's vision and align themselves fully with the community's values, they can undermine their ability to mediate any kind of community conflict. And also, if you celebrate difference too much in the community, you risk seeing people as categories, and you undermine a basis for common knowledge and experience. In the 1980s and into the 90s, we see a communicative turn in planning based on the work of German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. And his conception of communicative rationality sees a shift away from the individual who's making sense of the world by themselves through rational, empirical data gathering. Instead, knowledge is based on intersubjective processes, people talking, debating, dialoguing, making sense together through mutual understanding, through communication and debate. And because of that, knowledge in planning is contingent on and situated in a particular place and time and a particular community. So in communicative action in planning and collaborative planning, knowledge is constructed socially. It can take many forms. It can take the form of stories and interviews and surveys and all kinds of different ways of getting at neighborhood experiences to make sense together while living differently. In this conception, the planner explicitly avoids imposing their personal values because they are creating dialogic structures and processes to mediate competing interests. And it's all about seeking consensus. It's future seeking rather than being future defining. So as opposed to rational comprehensive planning for, advocacy planning with, radical planning by, this is planning together. We all need to come together in these processes. Now, the critiques of communicative, collaborative planning is that it really emphasizes process over outcomes. It may not take sufficient account of bad faith actors or imbalances of power in the community. It may be impossible to reach consensus. And the planner's own agenda, like the Just City or other projects, may be difficult to achieve. But collaborative planners counter that there are ways to anticipate and plan for all these things. And of course, they are bounded processes. The consensus seeking isn't going to take forever. The planning processes do have structure. But what these different modes illustrate over the past 70 years is that working for the public interest is really complex. It is really difficult to address wicked problems to everyone's satisfaction or to define them to everyone's satisfaction, because every constituency in a given community will have its own aspirations and values and political causes. There is no unitary public good. The planner's obligations then ethically are to multiple publics, a heterogeneous public. They can't be partisan for a particular constituency in the community. The planner and the government that it represents cannot coerce or convert the public. Incrementalism is the only ethically defensible path to social change in democracies. So we believe that this is the ethos that is missing from this debate in librarianship, is the complexities involved in the public interest and defining the problems and the multiple publics, and in a diverse, multicultural, multi-ethnic society like ours, trying to implement social change without social warrant, without democratic processes, just simply isn't permissible. But what these different modes of planning reveal then are two very different versions of value neutrality. Rational comprehensive planning's version of value neutrality was that values just didn't matter. They played no role. They were irrelevant. The planner was purely objective. Only positivist empirical facts mattered. But for the collaborative planner, this is a very different version of value neutrality. The planner recognizes that the planning processes are value laden and that decisions about what information to include or exclude are value laden. They're based on values. The planner is not value neutral. The stakeholders all represent a plurality of value systems. And therefore, the public institution, the planners, cannot impose a particular set of values on the stakeholders or the values of one stakeholder group on the rest. So this then leads us into, well, there is actually more to neutrality than just values. And in the literature of conflict resolution, we see that there's actually 3 additional elements. So besides the second form of value neutrality, there's stakeholder neutrality, process neutrality, and goal neutrality. With stakeholder neutrality, all stakeholders who are interested in the process are treated equally by the practitioner. They are given equal opportunity to participate. The planner doesn't publicly express favoritism or negative bias towards any stakeholder group. The democratic processes to which stakeholders are invited function in a transparent and equitable manner. Everyone knows what the rules are and are treated equally by the rules. Everyone's given the same set of information and the same opportunity to participate in decision-making processes. Goal neutrality means that you allow the stakeholders to make sense together and establish their own planning goals, rather than imposing the planner's goals or steering the participants to the planner's preferred conclusion. So what then do these different modes show us about these different dimensions of neutrality? Well, in rational comprehensive planning, there is that first version of value neutrality, but there is no other kind of neutrality because the planner is directing everything. In advocacy planning, the values of the planner and the community are the same, so there's no neutrality, but there is process neutrality. The advocate planner places those plans in front of the planning commission to be treated on the same basis as other plans. In radical planning, ideally, the planner should avoid imposing their values, but more often than not, as critiques in the literature show, the planners will simply assume the same values as the community. So there's no neutrality here at all either. But with collaborative or communicative planning, the planner doesn't impose their values, a definite ethical decision about that. There's stakeholder neutrality, process neutrality, and goal neutrality. So we believe that the radical planning here really is kind of analogous to what we're seeing in the critical and the radical librarianship literature, but that collaborative planning provides a pathway forward. So now I'm going to turn it over to John to show what this can give us in terms of a model for librarianship and a model for library neutrality.
So yes, what happens if, in fact, we shift this to libraries? Well, first of all, it clarifies, it provides something at last with regard to what value neutrality, what neutrality could be. That there's a vast difference between an ontological presumption that the institution and practitioners are value-free, and we've seen that in the states, in our state versions and in planning, and an ethical recognition that the institution is value-laden and a commitment that one's own value should not be imposed on the stakeholders. Most criticism in LIS, Library Information Services, mistakes the latter for the former, or just conflates them all into one uncritical, pardon the pun, mass. We would propose then communicative or dialogical librarianship. We'd like to use collaborative librarianship, but for the librarians in the audience will know that that word is already taken. So we're going to call it communicative librarianship. And this has an aspiration to neutrality regarding values, does not impose them on the community, nor those of one stakeholder group onto the others. The stakeholders, with regard to stakeholders, all diverse stakeholder groups are welcomed as participants to share their views and to listen to those of others. And if you'll remember from planning, they all have the same information base, which is important because that addresses some of the power issues that are also involved in this. With regard to processes, all stakeholders are aware of the rules of conduct and treated equally by them. And with regard to the goals, this is left up to the individual or group, respecting autonomy. This is goals developed by intersubjective meaning. So in communicative librarianship, there's an aspiration to, not a standard of neutrality, particularly regarding materials. So objectionable materials are collected by the library. They may be handled differently. They may not be collected in the same volume or content as the mainstream ones. They may be assigned for different purposes, but they're not banned, they are not shunted, they're not forbidden. They're neutral towards the community as a whole, but not towards users as individuals and their particular needs. In other words, no specific user or user group can impose their values on others. All, meaning the public, all have a right to access. Nobody has a right not to be offended by the content or the speakers. That's that imposition of value thing again. It's not passivity, in other words, I have problems with, and it's not moral relativism. There is judgment, and there is a process to handle this. And most importantly, it requires agentive action. There is that judgment, that professional judgment, and the bounded judgment of the state institutions that are involved. So if we go back and we look at this ALA Code of Ethics, I'll read this out and then I'll let Michael take the new version through to you. Notice the bolding here. We affirm the inherent dignity and rights of every person. We work to recognize, dismantle systemic and individual biases, to confront inequity and oppression. That's asking a lot of frontline library worker, I'm telling you. Even if we could define what inequity and oppression is within all contexts. To advance racial and social justice in our libraries. Again, that is asking a lot of somebody on $10 an hour or $15 an hour. And communities. There's a lot of good stuff in here. Dignity, rights in general, awareness, advocacy, education. These are all good things, don't get us wrong. But this would look very different if it was recontextualized through our lens.
And so what we've done is that we've applied our 4 level of neutrality, but just in principle, scaled this back to what librarians and library workers can actually do. We can't affirm the human rights of everyone. We can't adjudicate between competing rights. We can't confront oppression everywhere. So what can we do? We affirm the inherent dignity and autonomy of all library users. That's stakeholder neutrality. And each user's right to access the collections and services of the library for their own purposes. Goal neutrality. We work to recognize and dismantle potential barriers to access, which parenthetically are created by wicked social problems that may be experienced by all and any members in our communities as a result of their experiences of socioeconomic status, race, sex, ability, etc. We work to advance structures and processes that strengthen our profession and our institution's ability to provide all with opportunity for knowledge, education, participation, and dialogue, process neutrality, through advocacy, instruction, collaboration, services, and equitable allocation of resources and spaces, value neutrality too. So we haven't actually changed that many words, but by scaling it back to what the library worker, what librarians, what administrations can actually do for their communities and with their communities, we believe this is a much more reasonable and effective ethic that could help library workers navigate these controversies that they're facing. So in conclusion, the post-war urban form was developed under a presumption of neutrality by rational comprehensive planners, but that neutrality actually covered up the fact that it was actually undertaken with very definite ideas about the kinds of people that would live in subdivisions as opposed to public housing towers. And these were sometimes done with overtly racist procedures and processes like redlining. But the response of the 21st century collaborative planner dealing with this legacy is not to dismantle and disrupt the city or to impose a single ideology over the profession or to presume that members of the community are going to believe in those values, or to condemn members of the community for expressing values different to the planner's ideology and referring to them as bigots or hateful. The collaborative planner brings as many people together as possible, establishes the processes by which all can talk and listen and find common ground and work towards a more equitable future. Now, similarly, in librarianship, we are dealing with a legacy of a built environment and an intellectual environment structurally based on 19th century Victorian era concepts, the Dewey Decimal System from 1876, the Library of Congress system from 1898. Both of these systems have baked within them the racist and colonial ideas of their time. But again, so we agree with the critical librarians and the radical librarians that yes, libraries are not value neutral. These systems had values built right into them, and they create the streets and neighborhoods physically in our libraries where certain ideas are grouped together and other ideas are excluded. But we would argue for incremental change. The communicative librarianship model would create the structures, the processes to bring together people in the community to share information, their concerns, to debate, to dialogue, to clarify, to build knowledge, to make sense together while living differently, which is so important in our multicultural society. So again, library neutrality as a value is not an ontological assertion about what exists. It is a commitment to an ethical process consistent with liberal democracy. True to four-dimensional library neutrality would recognize the wickedness of socio-political problems and not assign simplistic blame or causes for these. It would recognize professional boundaries and competencies, that librarians don't have the social, the political warrant to actually change the broader society. It would involve affirming the process over the outcome and be comfortable with a permanent process. It would require that we are pluralist and inclusive of a diversity of views, like the Bill of Rights states. We would be facilitative, communicative, transparent, and welcoming, incrementalist and iterative, and oriented to long-term solutions at maintaining and preserving robust institutions and community resource, again, in the context of a liberal democratic institution, over short-term goals or single-issue crises. Communicative librarianship would clarify that tension that John talked about, harmonizing the values between democratic public oversight of the library and internal professional standards. It would result in a professional praxis of the context of the library as a liberal democratic institution, nurturing that guardian role of the library, and it would enable communities to plan together. So thank you very much for your time. I see there are a bunch of questions in the chats. Craig, did you want to share some of those with us?
Yes, thank you very much, Michael and John. This has been an extraordinarily rich conversation and presentation. I see there are both comments and questions, and I'm tracking back here to see the first one that I see comes from Joe Nalvin, and he's asking, can each approach of planning be co-opted, and would there be different guidelines to prevent the co-option of the different models for planning?
I guess I'll refer back to the slide where the critiques of collaborative planning about the possibility of bad faith actors and about power imbalances. The planner, thank you very much for the compliments that are coming through the chat. We really appreciate it. That's so nice. Standing ovation in the chat. Thank you. But yeah, the planner has to be aware of that possibility, and so too does the communicative librarian. And I think what's been happening with these controversies over speakers, over challenged materials, is that it's not been looked at so much as an opportunity for community dialogue. It's been more, dealt with as on a crisis basis. But really, if libraries as institutions had this up front, like we believe the ALA should actually retroactively insert neutrality as a word into their Bill of Rights. They need to define it. And if the profession and the library scholars knew on paper that this is what neutrality actually meant, that it wasn't this presumption of value neutrality that of course can't exist, that values don't matter, yeah. I think this really wouldn't be much of a problem.
Yeah, I have a couple of course, we have slightly different takes and we come from different backgrounds. The short answer is it can be co-opted. And this is part of the issue of trusting people and part of the issue of reflecting being bound by a community. That is what the community brings to us. So yes, bad faith actors can come in. Certainly transparency and proper procedures and good management take care of some of these things, but you can't count on all of those. I think what we're doing is we're goal setting. So I think the idea is, first of all, to say there should be neutrality. You should recognize what libraries are in their totality and in the public perspective and in the professional perspective, and use that to develop mechanisms, as Mike just talked about, mechanisms to handle these circumstances. So you could, for example, instead of implying terms of use, which is a top-down approach with the community, you could change that to a mutual charter of commitment, which would bind the community and the practitioner together as to what the library represents. And that could be your upfront.
Nice.
How you behave in the library, right? So, you know, just thinking off the top of my head, if you have a charter, which everybody has membership to that charter, that changes how you think about what you're doing right away. So yeah, it's how do we use this philosophy and these concepts to then create mechanisms? You know, we don't say we have the answer, it's just how do we think our way through to these answers?
So there are other questions that I'm quickly scanning. I think Ed Remus is asking about, is there a good theory of illiberalism? You mentioned you described liberalism brilliantly, but illiberalism we're often talking about now as being a force that's acting upon the field and other professions as well. So is there a good theory of illiberalism that you could briefly
I'll have to go
us
back
to?
and think on that. Because there's a large audience of libraries, I would suggest perhaps dialing up a introductory textbook on liberalism and illiberalism from your public or college library. There is no one definition, because it is by definition the antithesis of liberalism. So there are different illiberalisms, but most of them, again, most of them are partisan in form. That is the key component of illiberalism. If you want me to point to one thing, they are partisan, and I don't mean political party. I mean in that theory of the state version.
Yeah, I would recommend, and we had a slide of it, Adam Gopnik's A Thousand Small Sanities is a great introduction to liberalism. I would also refer people to Jonathan Rauch's The Constitution of Knowledge, which is also a great source on creating a liberal discourse.
The Constitution of Knowledge book, I think, is something that some members of our group today would know about. How do you see libraries contributing toward that web of institutions and norms that Jonathan Rauch describes in that book?
Well, better training.
Better training.
That's a library. That is very much a library school issue. In part, moving away from what we refer to as techno administrative managerialism to a better sense of understanding of the role of public agency and what public goods are. So part of that is definitely about education. I think part of it is very much in practice as well. It requires a lot of people, but it requires an environment certainly where you can be more thoughtful. And that is in itself, as we all are aware, very difficult to carve out. So I think there is if you like, a managerial class, specific managerial class response to this, which does have to balance the perennial do everything with less resources imperative that we're facing with issues of space and time, and how you think about how the public library works, not with the public, but with the government, works with all of its different agencies that it is entwined with, to be consistent in its messaging, and in fact to be an enabler of spreading this thought to other institutions. This is very much a political science thing. I'm deeply embedded from my own work in democratization, neo-institutionalism, and constructivism. These are the theories of how you do it within the public service, within institutions and organizations. But basically, the denser the network of institutions that you work in, the more likely you are to have liberal democratic outcomes. This is something that the international relations theorist Bob Kahane discovered a while back.
Yeah, and I would also add to that is we had a slide about the state of library science education. Again, when took library school in the early 90s, I don't recall, anything about the place of the library, within modes of governance. This past term, I mentored a graduate student in an I school, little dot I school, and she said that the curricula there was really no content at all about the library as an institution. It was all about information management. So I think library education really needs to talk about these political dimensions and the ethical commitments that go along with them.
Yeah, management is especially library management is much more than HR, budgeting, public communications, and information management, right? It really is a much bigger issue. And certainly I know we're old and gray, we received none of that, but I have seen nothing from my younger colleagues that indicates that they've had much background in these issues either.
Other comments or questions from the crowd today? Now, there are many good comments are coming in here, other suggestions for readings, from philosophers. I think Sarah, our co-convener here. Sarah, would you like to speak up with your question?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Craig. Thank you so much, Michael and John, for this really thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. My question stems back to the relationship between a state of crisis or perceived crisis and this enabling of more illiberal approaches to sudden radical changes rather than these kind of incremental, dialogic, small d democratic changes. And in the context of library practice, it seems to me that crisis is very related to notions of harm. So in general, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how we exit the state of crisis, or what the philosopher Agamben might call the state of exception that these crises enable.
That's a really good question. I like that quote. I'd like to follow up on that one. Yeah, I think again, I guess I would go back to planning. That planners over the post-war period were also dealing with various crises. There's a whole body of literature from what I did my graduate work on. Planners were, from 1945 to the early 60s, trying to figure out how to protect cities against nuclear war. So they were operating very much under the assumptions of a very urgent, earth-ending crisis. And the, environmental crisis on top of that, and poverty, housing, homelessness, and so on. But throughout all of that, planning has adopted more incremental and participatory and more liberal processes. The radical planning school, of course, does take that more urgent, more illiberal stream. But there is a variety of approaches.
Yeah, I would, from the political science background, I like to damage Kant by paraphrasing him, Immanuel Kant. Basically, sort of Kantism is, there's this sort of thing. Kant says, you don't change people, you just want to change how they behave, right? and I always find that a lot of illiberalism is about trying to change people rather than trying to change how they behave or what the outcomes are. And if you want to change, what's the box, the parameters, the boundaries within which you can effect change and not put yourself in crisis mode? And I work a lot with a set of tools, I like to call them, called new institutionalism in political science. And what it says in the broadest terms, particularly historical institutionalism, is that there are deep institutions in society. Institutions are not just the bricks and mortars. Or the very specific constitutional organizations, right? There's norms and there's habits. And to go against those things, which are taken deeply into people, organized socially, they're a priori to how you behave with constitutions and other things. This will tell you where you're swimming upstream. and where you're going, where you're really not going to be able to take it. And it gives you a good sense of incrementalism and how you can develop change and realize it through iteration, which is iteration, transparency, and a constant replication of positive results. Those are what, in fact, are the underpinnings of democracy. And so you can, with incremental iteration, you can change how people react to things, how they build trust in society, how they build trust in institutions, and eventually the directions they want to go. I'll give, for example, a classic example in Canada, which people might not be aware of in the United States. In the 1950s, Canada was as much, if not more, radically individualistic than in the United States, according to public opinion polling. However, with the birth of the post-war liberal welfare state in Canada, instituted by the Liberal Party and Walter Gordon, quick history lesson there, they started to put some things in place, notably single-payer public health care. And that went from socialist anathema to becoming a core identity of Canadian nationalism within 50 years, because it created a new normative and institutional and habitual infrastructure that Canadians were comfortable with. So these things can seem never to change, but can change quite profoundly and quite rapidly over time if you build trust in institutions and you get that kind of buy-in. And that's what neo-institutionalism is all about. Habermas, no, it was Mann, somebody else who's intersubjective, said that politics occurs at the interstices of concrete foundations or something. What it really means is we build institutions to solve problems. And so the problems now pop up in between the institutions. And so you've got to rejig the institutions and rejig the organization to address those problems. And so things become concretized and manifest again and again and again. So where are we? Iteration, incrementalism, addressing one problem as unique, and then moving on again.
And I would add to that the in the literature, as we had on that slide, that the accusation that neutrality was a mask that supported the status quo. Well, under liberal conditions and processes, allowing for incrementalism, there is no status quo because the underlying conditions are evolving and it allows for evolution and change. So there really is no static status quo in society.
Come back, yeah. Trustable, believable outcomes is the short answer, right? Constant reiteration. That's how you build and rebuild democracy. There's a Canadian political scientist, Peter Russell, I believe, the Dean of Canadian Political Science, who once said that Canada is not a country, it's a process. And that's why we're so process oriented, right? It's the same in the United States. It's
a more perfect
federalism is a process, right?
Yeah.
Our very foundation is process oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we still have some time. Other questions? This has been such a great presentation and ongoing conversation here. We'd like to hear from others, and also people have been asking. Yes, we recorded the presentation, and I believe Michael and John we can make the PowerPoint slides available.
Sure.
There's so much that can be built out from what they've done with this very nice framework and thinking about neutrality in a much more principled and richer way than the rather shallow way that we've been hearing about in recent years. So any other thoughts from anyone today while we're here together?
We had a question from Brian about planning theory, actually. Could you recommend a good general text or resource that gives a history or overview of planning in the context of your presentation?
Well, my favorite text is Dialogical Planning in a Multicultural Society by Harper and Stein, 2006. It's in the bibliography of the slideshow. Let me just grab it. Dialogical Planning in a Fragmented Society, Critically Liberal, Pragmatic, Incremental. A more left-leaning title would be Leonie Sander-Cox Towards Cosmopolis, which is a really good history of all of planning's modes, rational, etc. And that's from 1998.
Thanks, Michael. Any other questions today? Any other comments today?
You're welcome, and thank you for all the nice comments in the chat. I copied and pasted them. I haven't read them yet.
Well, we want to thank all of you for being with us today, and look forward to. We have work to do in the library profession in thinking about neutrality and replacing it on a more principled basis. And we think this is going on. This same debate is going on with different versions in other professions as well. So we're giving you today in this symposium our perspective from the library field, but those of you who are not librarians will also probably recognize or see some of the connections as well. So thanks everybody. And we look forward to hosting future events by HX Libraries, other symposia, other speakers in the future. And thanks again for attending.
Thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
Thank you.